Welcome back everyone to another article review series. So today we're going to go over the article that Ishwari Sawant wrote for Raya website, and it is called "A Weak Italian Economy Threatens the EU's Seeming Solidarity." Now you've all probably been hearing about the Corona bonds and how EU states are fighting on how the economic recession will be dealt with, and this is what we'll be talking about today. So just remember, once you see it, you won't help but notice. So what has been occurring is that Italy has been in the headlines of almost every major newspaper across the world in the past few weeks. And yes, it was about COVID-19 because it was a major blow to Italy, but another thing has been lurking around. And this is the Italian economic recession that will be coming straight after the coronavirus crisis. I mean, just like many other countries, they are battling an economic depression. This will come across the whole Eurozone and precisely to the countries that have been most affected by the coronavirus and that started their confination periods earlier. And this is a predicament which many European countries are unwilling to face, especially during the pandemic when it's most hard to deal with them. Italy has been deeply affected because they were one of the first European countries on lockdown, and unfortunately for its Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, the pandemic came at a very unfortunate time. Well, there's never really a fortunate time for a pandemic outbreak, but an unfortunate time for the economic situation of the country. Because right now, the country is surviving on consumer spending through foods and medicine, which at the end of the day is the only thing on the economy that's making money. And with a halt on manufacturing and production, all these businesses that have suddenly stopped their flow of income have started to run out of cash. And who are they going to turn to? Well, the banks. But the banks can't save every business. They are there to help other businesses, but they are already suffering a lot themselves. They have been piling up with bad loans and non-performing assets for the past years. And this is why we say it was not a great time. The banks were already suffering in Italy before the coronavirus crisis. And now with all these businesses defaulting on their loans, it's going to be a lot worse. And the result is that the Italian GDP is expected to contract by at least 3%. This is in the best case scenario. Now, you may be asking, what can we do? What can Italy do to save the banks and the economy? Well, the banks could begin to raise money by selling government bonds which they own. But because of offer and demand, if they begin to sell, the price of the bond will decrease as the rest of the world realizes that they are risky assets. Panic about economic uncertainty will increase dramatically, which will itself incentivize people to sell more Italian government bonds. So this seems like a never-ending cycle, right? That's precisely the issue, and this is called a doom loop. You sense that there is no faith in Italians' future if the Italian banks themselves are selling Italian government bonds. This makes sense, right? So as the banks are failing and the consumer spending is very weak and cannot sustain the economy by itself, what other options are left? To save the banks and businesses, the president, Conte, announced a €400 billion liquidity package to shield the economy from further deterioration. And this might seem like a good solution. So you may be asking yourself right now, where is the government going to get all this money from if there is no money flowing around? How is the government going to finance this debt? One way that the government can do this, besides taxes, is through bonds. But as mentioned earlier, an unstable economic environment, the value is very small on the bond. So it is difficult to get good funds from there. On the national front, the government's stuck between a rock and a wall. Although the government has been running a budget surplus for the past 19 out of 20 years, Italy also has the highest level of public to debt ratio in the Eurozone. The only other option that President Conte has, and southern European policymakers also have, is to get help from the European Central Bank. The Eurozone countries have been discussing two possibilities on how this could come around. Just please remember to subscribe and share the video with your friends if you're liking this content, so that we can continue growing our community, and please ask any questions on the comments below that you'd like to be answered in the following videos. Okay, so first let's look at the more viable option. Policymakers in Brussels have been eyeing credit lines for the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM. Right, for those that don't know what this is, it's basically a system that grants loans to national EU governments so that they can spend them at will. But the sum being discussed, the amount of money, is a loan program only worth 200 billion euros for all the countries. Now, this might seem like a lot of money for you, but for a reference point, Germany itself has announced a 1 trillion euro package to save its economy. So adding to that, if Italy borrows money from the European Stability Mechanism, it has been presumed that their debt levels would reach 160% of its GDP. You know, Spain sits at 100% of GDP and Germany's at 60% of GDP. Italy's could reach 160% of GDP. This help from the ECB could leave Italy and other borrowing countries even more vulnerable than if they didn't get that help. If this wasn't enough, Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, also stated that the organisation would not be pulling out all the stops possible to support the member states. The frantic stress following the announcement and her speech led to the worst stock market crash in Italy's history. The reaction was brutal. So loans might not be the best case scenario for Italy's economic crisis, but as of now, it's the only proposition on the table.
Now you maybe wonder, what's the other not so viable option? And that is Corona bonds. But it has been completely declined by the Northern European countries. The term Corona bonds has become popular amongst the economists in the Eurozone lately. What such a bond would do is group all of the debt from all the member states into one bond, which would then be backed and guaranteed by all the EU members. This will increase the stability of such a bond as well as maintain its value. Now, the stress of issuing the bond doesn't just fall on the hands of a weak financial nation like Italy, but also by the strong ones like Germany or Sweden. But Germany and the Netherlands, who enjoy fiscal flexibility and stability, don't want to partake in such Corona bonds because it threatens and increases their debt levels. This also implies that Italy and other economically vulnerable countries wouldn't worsen their fiscal deficit to such a large extent. So there really isn't any point in discussing this further, as this policy is completely off the table for many in Brussels. So it seems like we reached an impasse. The EU wants to help, but as in previous crises, it doesn't have the consensus to act. While the ECB has announced that its 750 billion euro program will purchase corporate and public bonds all over Europe throughout 2020, Merkel especially wants to avoid another disaster such as the Greek sovereign debt crisis, where the EU acted late and extremely badly. The European Stability Mechanism, which was basically created for preventing such an economic disaster, has not proven very useful either. Yet, they are unwilling to go all out. Fiscal sovereignty still remains crucial for many Eurozone nations. In other words, the taxpayer money in Germany is spent in German people, not in Italians. There is no union in this aspect. The current failure of the EU to come to a consensus has also given nationalist and populist parties reasons to open up debate for leaving the EU, just like Brexit did not so long ago. As the policymakers from the North and the South face off in Brussels, only time will tell if the right decision was made. As always, thank you so very much for watching, and remember to like this video and to comment any questions that you have and that you want answered in future videos. And remember, once you see it, you won't help but notice.